Right, it's noon, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Building Resilient and Affordable New Developments in the West, or Brand West Initiative webinar, Rethinking Rental Policy. I'm Lauren Cloward, a Senior Policy Advisor here at the Western Governors Association. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with WGA, I'd like to start us off just by sharing a little bit about what we do. We're an instrument of the governors from the 22 westernmost states and territories for bipartisan policy development, information exchange, and collective action on some of the most pressing problems of our generation. Upon becoming WGA chair last July, New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham launched Brand West as her 2025 chair initiative to focus on expanding access to housing in Western states. Over the last few months, the initiative has been examining strategies to address housing availability and affordability and promote smart and sustainable development in communities throughout the West. Findings and recommendations from the initiative, we've done a number of in-person events. This webinar, we'll be doing a work session as well, and those will be highlighted in a final report that WGA will publish in June in conjunction with our annual meeting in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So that brings us to our topic of conversation for today, which is rental housing. Attainable and diverse rental housing options are essential to supporting low income and entry-level households and providing a pathway to home ownership and upward mobility, as well as addressing a host of housing needs. We are facing a number of challenges that we'll get into during our discussion today, including a record high number of cost burden renters, 22.6 million across the US, spend more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities, and making the rental market a very difficult one for many Americans and increasingly difficult. So what we'll get into today is really exploring the role of renting and ensuring access to safe and affordable housing for Western residents, and then also examining some strategies to improve rental assistance, preserve existing rental units, and expand the rental supply. So before we jump into our conversation, I'd just like to recognize our amazing initiative sponsors, Arnold Ventures, JP Morgan Chase, the National Association of Home Builders, and the Pew Charitable Trusts. We couldn't do this work without them, so just a big shout out to all of their support. So let's get into it. We have a great lineup of panelists for you today. We have Benjamin Preis, who is the director of the National Housing Crisis Task Force and a senior research fellow for the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at the Drexel University Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation. We have Robert Henson, senior housing policy specialist for the National Council of State Housing Agencies. We have Cheryl Cohen, Housing Division Administrator for the Montana Department of Commerce and Executive Director of the Montana Board of Housing. And then we'll also have Megan Yonke joining us here today. She's a Senior Housing Policy Advisor for the Office of Colorado Governor Jared Polis. So I am going to turn it over to our great panelists to share some brief opening remarks, talk a little bit about how their work relates to the topic of conversation today, and then we'll get into a moderated discussion, which I'll moderate. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them, either having people kind of respond throughout, but we'll definitely try to leave some time at the end to get to any questions that weren't answered that way. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ben.
Lauren, thanks so much, and thanks to the Western Governors Association for having me today. As you said, I'm Ben Preis. I'm the director of the National Housing Crisis Task Force. If you haven't heard of us, I'm not surprised. We've only been around for about 9 months now. The National Housing Crisis Task Force was launched in July of 2024 as a bipartisan multi-sectoral group of housing practitioners to really look at state and local solutions to address the housing crisis. It's co-chaired by Governor Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah, Mayors Andre Dicken and Justin Bibb of Atlanta and Cleveland, and Susan Thomas from Fifth Third Bank CDC. And then we have 24 additional task force members all across the United States from all parts of the housing ecosystem, housing finance agencies, public housing authorities, investors, developers, et cetera, really trying to bring folks to the table to say the moment is now when we have a crisis, and what do we need to do in order to build our way out of this shortage. Though we're focused on state and local solutions to the housing crisis, we launched in the middle of an election year. And so we did put out a federal housing policy agenda that was released in early November 2024, the day before the election. And so this federal housing policy agenda was released not knowing the outcome, not knowing who was going to be president or in control of Congress. And there are 40 holistic policy recommendations that we believe are bipartisan and could have bipartisan support to address the housing shortage in a range of issues, including rental housing, including homeownership, including high income, and as well as market rate and deeply subsidized housing. As we're working on the state and local action plan, we also have a mayor's implementation committee with our partner Accelerator for America, with implementation partners at the local level in many Western states, including Arizona, California, Texas, and Washington. That's the task force. Given our national purview, I was asked to do a little setting of the table around rental housing. And so, we think of the US as a nation of homeowners, and very much homeownership is tied to the American dream. But 1 in 3 US households are renters. That's elevated from before the Great Recession, but only slightly. Before the Great Recession, it was around 31%. And so we really do have a large portion of Americans who are renters, and that number is higher, especially in big cities and major metros, as well as with non-white households. And so, there are lots of Americans who rent who look really different. In fact, over the last decade, the demographic that's seen the most growth among households that are now renters are actually high-income households earning more than $75,000 a year, have seen a growth in the number of high-income households that are renters rather than owners, in large part because of the shortage of homes that we have. Estimates vary, but we have at minimum a 4 million unit shortage of homes of all shapes and sizes, including rental and homeownership. And that really drives folks to the rental market, in part because of the conversion of ownership opportunities into rental opportunities following the Great Recession. As Lauren, you mentioned, cost burdens are at record high. Cost burden is defined as paying 30% or more of your gross income in rent. And today the median renter, so half of all renters, pay more than 30% of their income in rent. When we think about low-income renters in particular, there are various forms of rental assistance. One is public housing. Public and other subsidized housing represent around 6% of the rental housing stock nationally. This includes public housing and other programs for seniors and individuals with disability. But that looks very different in different sorts of markets. And then our other major form of rental assistance is housing choice vouchers. Unfortunately, only 1 in 4 households that are income eligible for vouchers actually receive them. And so there are millions of households who have low incomes and would be eligible for vouchers. But given the fact that the number of vouchers are set in part by statute every year due to appropriations, 75% of low-income households that are eligible for vouchers don't actually qualify. The one last thing I'll say is that much of our rental housing stock is in pretty bad shape. The median mid-sized apartment in the US is 56 years old. That means that the median mid-sized apartment in the US is in need of capital repairs. Many subsidized rental projects with USDA Section 515 or the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, project-based rental assistance, all of those have limited lifespans of required affordability and require capital upgrades after 15, 30, 40 years. And we're expected to lose hundreds of thousands of affordable units as well as naturally occurring affordable units over the coming years, in part because of the need for capital upgrades. So that's both the overview of the task force and a little bit about setting the table for rental housing, and I will pass it to my other panelists.
Thank you, and we'll have Robert go next.
Thanks very much. As mentioned earlier, my name is Robert Henson. I'm a senior housing policy specialist for the National Council of State Housing Agencies. NCSHA represents all 50 plus the various territorial housing finance agencies, which most folks are probably aware, but housing finance agencies, or HFAs, are state chartered entities that are established to help meet the affordable housing needs in their states. HFAs vary pretty widely across the country in terms of their exact relationship to the state government. Some are part of the state cabinet. Others are sort of quasi separate entities, but they all share a number of features that make them really important entities for purposes of any conversation about affordable housing, and particularly affordable rental housing. Namely, they all enjoy bonding authority to issue bonds in support of developing affordable housing, and they all generally, with a few exceptions, they all generally allocate their state's allocation of the low-income housing tax credit. And so NCSHA is primarily engaged in advocacy around a handful of federally authorized programs, including the housing bonds and the housing credit, as well as the Home Investment Partnerships Program, the FHA Risk Share Program, several of the USDA Rural Housing Service programs, and others. So HFAs really do play a sort of central role in affordable housing throughout the country. Since inception, or the 70s, some nearly 4.5 million affordable rental housing units have been constructed by HFAs across the country, many of which are constructed using primarily the housing credit, which is arguably the single most important tool that we have in a federal resource to develop affordable housing, but it's not the only one. So one of the things that I think is important to note about the time, this time in particular, is tremendous uncertainty sort of abounds here in Washington about sort of the direction of federal housing policy. But a couple of things I think are true and will hold true regardless of where we go from here. One of which is that the housing credit enjoys a tremendous bipartisan support. Legislation that was introduced in the last Congress and will be introduced soon in this Congress enjoyed broad bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. In the House, I believe it was the single most widely co-sponsored legislation that was referred to the House Ways and Means Committee, so the tax writing committee. The second is that I think as the federal government's sort of footprint or role shifts and changes, I think the role of the state HFAs is going to increase and grow in importance sort of exponentially, because as federal resources are potentially put at risk, or as there's uncertainty about federal policy, I think HFAs are sort of uniquely situated to be able to continue to deliver benefits to low-income households that need a place to rent or live. And so I think it's really important to sort of highlight and sort of elevate the role of state housing finance agencies in this period when the sort of role of federal policy in housing is to some degree uncertain as to where we go from here. So I think the main thing for us right now in this in the 119th Congress, I think, as we're looking to a budget reconciliation process that will likely involve significant changes to the tax code, the number one priority above all is to see some of those changes that were articulated in that standalone legislation, the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Improvement Act, actually become part of the ultimate reconciliation process that we expect Republicans in Congress to proceed with. And so there's just a handful of changes to the affordable housing credit, to the housing credit, that we think would have a dramatic impact on the ability of state HFAs using the housing credit to deploy those resources and increase the supply of affordable rental houses in their states, namely to restore the 12.5% cap that expired at the end of 2021, and then to further increase the housing credit allocation authority by 50% over a number of years, and then additionally to lower lower the test for bond financing from 50% to 30% or 25%. It depends on what Congress chooses to enact. But those two changes alone would have the impact of unlocking financing for millions of new affordable homes. And simultaneously, I think it's also very important for folks to recognize that the housing credit does not work in a vacuum. It does not work without the favorable tax treatment, for example, that private activity bonds enjoys. It does not work usually without other additional sources of financing, soft financing, like through the Home Investment Partnerships Program. And so while it is the single most important tool, it's not the only tool in the toolbox. And it's very important for Congress to recognize this full sort of suite of tools that are available to states to develop affordable housing, to protect the favorable tax treatment of private activity bonds, to expand the housing credit, and to ensure adequate appropriations for a variety of programs that support rental housing, including the Home Investment Partnerships Program, as well as all of the rental assistance accounts that Benjamin had mentioned earlier. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to the panelists and look forward to any questions or the discussion to follow.
Thank you, Robert. Really appreciate it. And Cheryl, we'll go to you next.
Certainly. Well, first, I want to thank the Western Governors Association and Lauren and her team for inviting me to be on this panel today. And thank you to my fellow panelists. So again, my name is Cheryl Cohen. I serve as the Housing Division Administrator with the Montana Department of Commerce. And we have an administratively attached Montana Board of Housing, which is the state of Montana's housing finance agency. And I serve as the Executive Director in that capacity. Within the Housing Finance Agency side of business, as Robert indicated, we're responsible for allocation of the low-income housing tax credits. We also issue tax-exempt bonds for both single-family and multifamily programs. We provide first-time homebuyer programs and down payment assistance. And we service those loans here in-house. We have about 6,000 mortgage loans that we service, and we also partner with the Idaho Housing and Finance Association for our going forward production. So we're really focused on getting as much supply as we can, including leveraging all of the low-income housing tax credits, both the 9% competitive tax credit as well as the 4% credit, which can be leveraged with that allocation of tax-exempt bonds. And although Montana isn't currently what we call volume cap constrained with our private activity bonds, we are approaching that place where we will be competing against ourselves between our own single family and multifamily programs. So glad to be using all the resources that we can, and clearly there's a need for more. Elsewhere in our housing division, we also have our statewide public housing authority. So we administer federal rental assistance programs across all 56 states in Montana. And we do that in partnership with 10 field agency partners, which are other local public housing authorities or human resource development councils. And then finally, we also administer HUD CPD programs. So that includes the Home Program, National Housing Trust Fund, and Community Development Block Grant. And essentially any program that came out under the Consolidated Appropriations Act or the ARPA bill came to our shop as well to stand up and administer. So if it's a federal program that touches affordable housing, my team and I do that here at our shop. Just a couple of things to add to color of the rental market. So some of you may have seen a story that came out in 2022 in the Washington Post, and it was looking at mid-sized counties and rent increases between 2020 and 2022. And here in Helena, the capital here in Montana, is situated in Lewis and Clark County, which has about 70,000 residents. And Lewis and Clark County was the county that experienced the 5th largest rent increase between that 2-year period at 35%. So although we can see that there's challenges and, urban areas like Missoula or Bozeman, higher cost centers, it's really impacting our mid-sized communities and smaller communities as well. Between 2010 and 2020, Montana's population grew by 10%, but our housing supply only grew by 7%. So it really does become just a game of musical chairs, and there's not chairs for everybody to sit. And so our job is to utilize the resources that we have to our best of our ability to serve the most vulnerable Montanans whose needs aren't being met elsewhere in the market. So I'll go ahead and pause there and turn it back to Lauren and their final panelists, and happy to chat a bit more about the work here in Montana.
Thanks, Cheryl. Megan, over to you.
Thanks so much for having me and for everybody who attended. My name is Megan Yonke. I'm the Senior Housing Policy Advisor for Colorado's Governor Polis. We're attacking the housing crisis from both the supply and demand side. And I think the most important message is we need to protect what we already have in light of President Trump's executive order to save people money on housing. First, to talk about the demand side, we know that even if we go gung-ho on our supply side, it is very unlikely that units will be delivered at sub 60% AMI, hence the need for vouchers. We focus our vouchers in the state of Colorado on permanent supportive housing, and for supportive housing alone, 440 vouchers were applied for, only 124 project-based vouchers that were awarded. So incredible demand for that product. We administer about 8,000 total federal vouchers, and we also have a state voucher source of 2,500 state vouchers. Our need on the homelessness side alone is great. We have 45,285 households experiencing homelessness in Colorado. And if we expanded to our work on prevention, it would be many, many more in need of tenant-based vouchers. On that front, we have an emergency rental assistance program that we're evaluating at this time as an extension of the federal program. But let's turn to the supply side. If the federal government wished to really encourage supply of affordable housing, they might prioritize tax credits or add incentives for states that have prioritized land use reform and permitting reform. In the state of Colorado, we've enacted over the last year transit-oriented communities bills, ADUs allowed throughout the state, parking minimums abolished in certain areas, occupation limit prohibitions but for health and safety. And in this session, we're looking at Yes in God's Backyard to allow automatic entitlements to faith-based institutions and educational institutions, as well as single stair reform. We've incented public transportation. We are in the process of updating Front Range Rail and Mountain Rail. We've incentivized modular through our innovative housing incentive program, as well as other innovative construction methods. And we've seen a 687% increase in modular units produced in Colorado and an increase to the total percentage of housing developed to 3.7%. Also, maybe consider past matching state funded credits. I know this is hard for a lot of folks, but in Colorado, we've passed $1 billion in state tax credit to pair with federal sources and to be standalone. We've passed Proposition 123, which is an automatic allocation of state budget of at least $300 million a year toward housing gap financing and programs. And we've also enhanced our programs on the middle income housing and had a renewed focus on homeownership. And then finally, I will just say clean energy has been a very important part of us reducing costs in the housing space. We've passed a requirement that even though we don't have a statewide building code, all municipalities who update their building code have to update to IECC 2021. And we also have Energy Star ratings that I would have to get my colleagues in to answer questions and follow up if you have it. But in our last round of 4% tax credits, which we pair with a state credit, 67% of applicants were all electric and only 4 were mixed fuel buildings. So we're really trying to double down on our use of clean energy in affordable housing. With that, I'll turn it back over.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And that brings us to the moderated discussion part of this webinar. I think we're going to focus a lot based on WGA's focus on federal advocacy for Western priorities. So I really want to jump into some of the specifics with federal programs. And as we know, there are a lot, both on the supply and the demand side. So jumping into some of those specific recommendations for changes that could be made at the federal level. And I want to go ahead and start us on rental assistance. So based on, all of your different and unique experiences, what recommendations do you have to make federal rental assistance programs function more effectively, especially for Western states and residents?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in, Lauren. So one of the things that Montana did as the statewide public housing authority is we've been tracking a disconnect between HUD's what are called fair market rents and the actual rents in our communities that people would need to have support for to be able to be eligible to apply. So a little get in the wonky weeds here, but HUD's FMRs are based on the standard quality rental units from recent movers at the 40th percentile. And the methodology that HUD has deployed for this has been really problematic, I think, in a number of Western states where it's not just rural communities, but in Montana, frontier communities where there just isn't a sufficient rental stock to develop a statistically relevant sample size in order to derive those fair market rents. And so we got to such an acute place where a voucher wouldn't even cover a 60% area median income low income housing tax credit rent. And that's a pretty upside down situation for us to be in because we often want to pair project-based vouchers within low income housing tax credit properties. So there is an ability within current statute to conduct what's called a fair market rent reevaluation and submit that data for a statistically valid survey to HUD and ask that your FMRs be readjusted. Montana undertook that survey fourth quarter of last year, and we submitted our data to HUD in January, and we're waiting for their response, which should be coming in next month. But I'll just read a little of what our study found. So the survey results determined that the 40th percentile of rent for fiscal year 25 is 374 more than the median state non-metropolitan HUD fiscal year fair market rent, and $634 more than the median U.S. non-metropolitan HUD FMR rent. And we included in our submission the question, this begs the question as to HUD's justification for utilizing the lower of the two standards, meaning the state minimum standard, in particular for a situation such as this, where a local survey provides proves how profoundly mismatched that information is. So when we're looking at the challenge of, one, not enough vouchers to serve those who are eligible, but for those who are issued vouchers, unfortunately, about 50% of those are not able to successfully lease up in the market within 120 days because they can't find a rental unit that's within the fair market rent standards, or the unit, because of Montana's aging housing stock, doesn't meet HUD's housing quality standard requirements. So we would like to see some movement at HUD, and we've worked with our federal delegation on this matter to see if HUD can really relook at how they determine fair market rents. I know they've made some efforts to bring in some private market sources, but those sources really don't exist for states like Montana. And we need those vouchers to support Montana citizens just like they would support citizens in higher cost cities on the West and East Coast.
Thank you, Cheryl. Robert or
Yeah, I'll
Megan?
jump in quickly. One of the issues that I alluded to earlier is with respect to the Rural Housing Service, and this applies, I think, particularly in Western states. For folks who aren't aware, I imagine most of you are, but the Section 515 program at the United States Department of Agriculture, Rural Housing Service, has been a source of financing in the past for affordable rental housing in rural areas. I think some of the most recent estimates that I've seen are that there are some 400,000 and change rental units currently in USDA's portfolio under the Section 515 program. The problem is that there has been no new financing of Section 515 properties in many years, and those properties are subject to affordability restrictions only for the duration of the 515 mortgage securing the property. And so what's happening is, and this process is going to continue to accelerate in the coming years, as those 515 mortgages are either prepaid or mature naturally, those properties are at very real risk of falling out of any sort of definition of affordability and essentially converting to market rate properties in communities where there is a very real lack of affordable housing options. So one of the initiatives, and this is currently in a sort of pilot format that has been allowed by Congress through recent appropriations legislation, is to provide an incentive for owners and operators of those properties when those mortgages mature or are prepaid to remain affordable by allowing the rental assistance that was coupled with that 515 mortgage under Section 521 rental assistance to remain with the property and continue to sort of stand with the property, even though the Section 515 mortgage is no longer in effect. And so what this has the incentive, or has the effect of doing, hopefully, and we'll see as they sort of roll out this pilot program, is to allow or give an incentive to owners to retain that sort of steady source of federally backed rental income, while trading the option of converting that property to market rate. And so, as I mentioned, this is really just a pilot at this point. I think they're authorized to do up to 1,000 units in 2025. But we know, and USDA has made clear that this problem again will accelerate because the timing of when these mortgages were initially made, we're reaching that sort of 25 or 30 year period where those will begin to expire naturally, and many of them are being prepaid. And so we anticipate that 1,000 units will be enough for this year. But in future years, out years, we anticipate many, many more of those over 400,000 units in USDA's portfolio to come into this situation where they are at very real risk of converting to market rate or losing affordability restrictions. And so I think one thing to watch very carefully from a federal perspective is the rollout of this what they're calling either decoupling the rental assistance from the mortgage, or what they're now calling standalone rental assistance, allowing the rental assistance to stand alone from or separate from the mortgage is to watch USDA's pilot of this initiative roll out and see if it does have the intended effect of allowing those or encouraging those properties to remain in the portfolio of of properties that are restricted to affordability based on average median income, or if there's still remains risk. And if the program is successful, if the pilot is successful, I think a really important priority for really any state with a USDA RD portfolio is going to be to advocate for additional authority for USDA to meet the demand that's going to exist as more and more of those mortgages expire. And so I think this is going to be a really important area for folks to watch in coming fiscal years through the appropriations process, in all likelihood, to make sure that the resources are available and that the authority exists for USDA to continue this decoupling process as more and more of those properties become at risk. So I think that's one important area of sort of rental assistance that I think would behoove us all to sort of focus on, particularly those of us in rural states.
Thank you, Robert. And Megan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just to add to that, recently in the last couple of years, we have increased our payment standards to up to 110, 115% of fair market rents and have seen a more significant uptake of vouchers. I will also say that in the state of Colorado, we have source of income discrimination laws, which a lot of people hope would have more enforcement, but those two things coupled together have been resulting in higher uptake of vouchers. Still a lot of work to be done, but some significant movement that shows that what Cheryl is talking about with payment standards would really make a big difference.
And Lauren, if I could just add two things. One of the recommendations from the task force in our federal housing policy agenda was around streamlining some of the processes around the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Landlords who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program often report that the administrative burden is quite high. And there are some efforts around, especially the inspection process for units to enter the Housing Choice Voucher Program, either pre-inspections or allowing local inspections for new build to be counted towards the HUD quality standards that should make it easier for landlords to participate in the program and therefore increase the success rate of voucher holders. I'll also say briefly to Megan's point, to Cheryl's point about the cost and the disconnect between fair market rent. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that increasing supply will also bring down the cost of the voucher program writ large, because vouchers need to be responsive to rents and rents are responsive to supply. And so, building housing at all levels of affordability will also make the Housing Choice Voucher Program and USDA Section 5.1 program go further in supporting more households under the same appropriations if we can bring rent down.
Thank you, Ben. Great points there. I'd like to move us now next and kind of based on some of the throughways that we've had with supply here in this conversation and noting the effect that supply has on the market. And before we kind of jump into new development in those pieces, I want to touch on some of the points that you mentioned, Ben, I think in your opening remarks with, units falling into disrepair and then being lost, as, Robert mentioned, to other market conditions. So what are some of the, specific, how can the federal government better support housing development, or I guess the preservation of rental units, and how can those programs be improved? And I know, again, we've touched a little bit on this, but want to dig into that a little more deeply.
I would note one area within the housing credit space that NCSHA has been focused on is what is known as the right of first refusal, or also the qualified contract issue. So under ordinary circumstances, housing units that are produced using the housing credit are subject to at least a 15-year affordability period, but there's often an extended use period that goes up to 30 years. But there are ways for property owners to sort of short circuit that affordability period. And one of the ways that they do that is through a qualified contract, which is essentially and I'm not the expert in this, but they use they accept sort of bids, and Cheryl, please jump in if I'm missing something. But essentially, they're allowed to sell the housing unit that's supported through the housing credit under certain circumstances, and then at which point it sort of exits the affordability period and is now become essentially market rate. So one of the things that many states have done, and I'm not sure, I imagine a number of states in the Western United States have done this as well, is put in their qualified allocation plan for how they allocate the housing credit restrictions that essentially say preemptively, developers, you by accepting an allocation of housing credits for your property development, you agree not to use this qualified contract process to exit the program early. And so I think that's one of the areas that we've been focused on, sort of advocating at the state level for states to implement some sort of protections like this in their state allocation plan, but also potentially looking at changes to the housing credit program in statute to further restrict this ability for properties to exit the program early.
Yeah, Robert, I'd say, go ahead, Ben.
Sorry, Cheryl, you go ahead.
I was just going to add on the qualified contract. Yeah, that's certainly something that Montana has added to our qualified allocation plan. And we actually have a 35-year extended use period, so a total of 50 years for tax credit developments. And, my background, I think there's both the preservation question, but there's also just the asset management of even newer projects that we have in our portfolio. So prior to moving to Montana, I had experience with the City of Seattle Office of Housing on their asset management team. And, there's no building, no mission, is what a supervisor of mine once told me. And I think that that's a really important thing for us to consider, is not just how can we preserve what we have, but how can our inspection process and our collaboration with the developers and the owners and property management teams help to ensure that these taxpayer funded properties are maintained in safe and tenable condition for the long term. And of course, 50 years is a long time, and things will certainly probably need some influx of capital for repairs in that interim, but there are really good asset management practices out there. And so the extent that housing finance agencies can be a vehicle for technical assistance or collaboration with our property managers and developers throughout the state, that's certainly a priority here in Montana. And to the kind of ensuring the preservation of existing portfolio, Robert mentioned the Affordable Credit Housing Improvement Act, which I believe still includes a 12.5%, restoring that 12.5% cut that was present during the Trump 1 administration. And in Montana, that 12.5% boost means another project could be done. And one project is another one that's certainly beneficial. And when we look at across the state of Montana with project-based Section 8 portfolio, rural development, housing, moderate rehabilitation, it seems that all of the other federal programs tend to point to the low-income housing tax credit as the one all be all source to help preserve all of these other projects. And, certainly we're trying to thread the needle between ensuring that we're focused on getting new production to the market because of that broader impact on supply and rent decreases at large, as Ben mentioned. But we also need to preserve what we have, particularly in our small communities. So Montana's really looked at using not just our federal resources, but some small state resources that we've had through our Cold Trust Severance Tax Fund to provide that rehabilitation support for those smaller properties. It can be really hard to do, fourplex in Winnett, Montana, for example, just the economy of scale. So we have a developer right now proposing what's called the Montana 6. So it's a combination of 6 different small project-based Section 8 properties scattered in 7 different cities. And so that's a really good thing for us to look at and figure out how we can preserve all of that portfolio.
I think just to build off of what Robert and Cheryl were saying, right, I would talk about preservation in sort of 3 different buckets, right? One is expiring affordability, and how do you preserve subsidized affordable housing where you currently have low-income tenants and they may be facing either rent hikes or evictions. And that's what Robert was really talking about with the qualified mortgage, as well as a right of first refusal. And then you have end-of-life and capital needs, both for subsidized affordable housing as well as for naturally occurring affordable housing. And end-of-life and capital repairs basically boils down to money, right? One source of funding, to Cheryl's point, is often pointed to as the low-income housing tax credit. 4% tax credits can often be used for preservation and capital upgrades. And so lowering that private activity bond threshold from 50% to 25%, expanding the private activity bond cap for states that have met the cap, can expand the pool of capital. Federal government could introduce a new preservation capital product that seems unlikely in the current climate that we're in, but was one of the recommendations in the task force agenda. And then I also want to mention, when we're talking about preservation, insurance. Insurance is a major cost driver of existing affordable housing developments. There's been massive increases in property and casualty insurance for multifamily properties. You often have replacement cost in your insurance that can add huge annual premiums when you're considering the increase in construction materials over the past couple of years. And subsidized affordable housing developments, which can't raise rents on tenants, have really nowhere to have an escape valve when it comes to paying for those operating costs. And so insurance can actually cause a preservation issue when operators are no longer able to run a property or a portfolio profitably, or at least at cost. And so we've seen in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, some affordable housing developers actually exiting and declaring foreclosure or declaring bankruptcy, which can bring us back to the expiring affordability problem when you simply no longer have operating revenues that are sufficient to cover operating costs, and that can result in subsidized affordable housing units exiting affordability even before their end of life or capital needs.
I'll just add that Governor Polis is very much focused on adding housing supply to the market. Not to say that preservation is not an important strategy, but it's definitely, and when you have to do both, and the focus is definitely on the creation of more units. Although preservation is an eligible cost for all of our state funding sources, and there are projects being funded, it is also an eligible use of all of our state tax credits. But to your point, Ben, we are actually running two dueling insurance bills in our session this year, one of which is focused on transparency between property owners and insurance companies to give them a more accurate read of what home hardening and fire resistance measures they could do to improve their insurance premiums, for example. And then we have another bill that is kind of a light, I'm going to butcher this, but a little bit of a reinsurance market using two enterprises for both hail, which is about 70% of our total insurance costs and losses in the state of Colorado, and wildfire. So we're hoping that does filter through to the operating expenses of many of our naturally occurring and deed restricted affordable projects.
Thank you, Megan. And I think your comment about supply is obviously a good segue for us to talk about how the federal government especially can help support development of new rental housing and new rental units. Obviously, we know that housing, a lot of those levers exist at the local level, but there are a number of ways that we can enact change at the federal level that help support new housing supply and development. So I'll open the floor now, and it looks like Cheryl's off mute if you want to get started.
So one of the things that Montana is really excited about is HUD put forth a pro-housing NOFO. Last year they did 2 rounds, and this was really something to help support local communities and states in adopting pro-housing growth measures, whether it be land use reform, zoning, permitting, building use code, et cetera. As many of you guys may know, Montana did pass a suite of legislation in our 2023 session that some media outlets dubbed the Montana Miracle. This included our Montana Land Use Planning Act that front-loaded public participation processes to kind of that zoning growth management discussion. construction and try to minimize it once you get to the project approval stage. We also had bills to allow ADUs in single-family zones, duplexes in single-family zones, mixed-use commercial, and we have others that are circulating in our legislative session right now, including a single stair, parking minimums, and so forth. So I'm, really honored to work under the Gianforte administration here in Montana, where there's been this focus on increasing the supply for all income levels of all housing types, and how can we really best reinvigorate our small towns and look at infill development in a way that's going to be meaningful, and also just looking at that dichotomy between personal property rights and the ability for property owners to build what is needed in the market on land that they own, but also to preserve our open spaces in Montana and reduce sprawl. So those were all a great nexus of thinking and coming together where it could be a true bipartisan effort here in Montana. So we're just looking to increase that supply mentality here in Montana. We had a bill passed that provided our another sister organization, the Montana Board of Investments, with funds to provide low interest rate loans and financing for the infrastructure for new housing growth. So the water, sewers, and streets, which is incredibly important. And we have another bill in our session right now to expand that program. It's been really popular and has gotten a lot of good use, and it ties to the new housing growth, but also to a certain density. So wanting to make sure that we're building responsibly and with considerations for a broader economy and environment.
Cheryl, Robert?
I'll just throw out there, aside from the housing credit, I would argue the single most important piece of federal resources is the Home Investment Partnerships Program, which is the largest federal block grant dedicated really exclusively to affordable housing. Obviously, CDBG is great, but you can use CDBG for all sorts of things. Home is really just about building new homes. And it has come under pressure in recent years in terms of the appropriation that it receives from Congress. I think part of the reason, one of the really challenging things about HUD's budget is, as Benjamin alluded to, as rental assistance continues to increase, the cost of renewing all existing rental assistance continues to increase. That's squeezing HUD's budget from one end. But on the other end, a big chunk of HUD's budget comes from the FHA and mortgage insurance premiums and Ginnie Mae securitization activities. And so when FHA activity declines, as it does in an interest rate environment like we're in now, there's actually less money coming into the department. So the remaining chunk of what HUD does, besides rental assistance and FHA over here, is these sort of core block grant programs to include CDBG, but also home. And those programs have really been squeezed in recent years in terms of the amount of money that's available for appropriators to provide for them. But I think bang for your buck, home is probably about as good as it gets in terms of a federal resource that's not the housing credit, in terms of the ability to use those resources really in a variety of different ways, including things like down payment assistance and homeowner rehab, et cetera. But the vast majority of it is used for either new construction or rehabilitation of affordable rental housing, and it's very frequently present in housing credit transactions. It's just a really important tool. I'm sort of biased. NCSHA chairs something called the Home Coalition, which is a large group of national organizations as well as state chapters of Habitat for Humanity and hundreds of sort of state organizations that really advocate for this program. But it has been under some real strain in recent years because of a lack of federal appropriations. And then one other thing I'll put in a plug for, again, from the HFA side of things, is a program, sort of an unsung hero, but it's called the HFA Risk Share Program. And this is where it allows, I don't think Montana uses a risk share, but I think Colorado is actually a pretty prolific risk share lender. And it allows for credit enhancements to HFA bond and debt issuances through FHA multifamily mortgage insurance. And it's been really very, very successful. I think the data that I have most recently is about $20 billion in financing for approximately 220 affordable rental homes since 2001, when the program began. And there's some 28 HFAs, again, a number of them out west that participate in this program. But it is, like I said, kind of an unsung hero that flies a little bit under the radar. But for those state HFAs that take advantage of it, it is a very powerful tool to sort of, again, fill in those gaps when the housing credit transactions might not otherwise work out. So those are the two things that I would say it's really important to advocate for, and would encourage states to advocate their elected officials here in Washington, D.C. to not only expand the housing credit, but also increase appropriations for the home program, as well as to protect and preserve the FHA risk share program.
Robert, that's super helpful, and glad you brought up something besides LIHTC as well, because I know that especially in Western states where there's a lot of rural areas, frontier areas. I know Cheryl talked a little bit about that, but LIHTC and some of those other kind of prolific federal programs for development don't always work in those sorts of settings as well. So just thinking too about, some of the differences between those urban and rural areas and what multifamily development looks like there. So thanks.
If I could just jump in here, Lauren, just to get to some of the things that Cheryl is talking about, but in terms of cost drivers, a lot of our land strategies, both on the YAGB bill as well as our ownership of state land, is coming to terms with the fact that land in a lot of areas of the state is upwards of 20% or 30% even of total development costs. So trying to take that out of the picture. Also, there was a Pew Research study that was just published that showed that both the second stairwell and the unused space in the corridor and other design factors were responsible for 6 to 13% of total development costs in a building, not including the cost of aggregating larger spaces of land and competing with other sources like parks that need larger spaces for their uses. I would say, given that we're trying to talk about some federal reform, there's definitely some need for some common sense reform to Davis-Bacon and NEPA. I think it's gotten way out of control. We're seeing partners who don't want to accept home funds at all because it automatically comes with the 20% increase just for residential Davis-Bacon, not including commercial. And it applies even if Davis-Bacon rates are less than minimum wage in the community. So just a lot of room for some no-nonsense administrative reforms to that bill. Also, NEPA has really gotten out of control with its regulation of vapors, as well as regulating water from downstream sources. Just a lot of room for some common sense reforms to both of those pieces of legislation to allow home dollars to go further.
Yeah, I cannot emphasize that enough, Megan. It's interesting. You see home developments usually cap at about 11 home units per development because Davis-Bacon restrictions kick in at 12 units. And so it's just an artificial sort of, limit on the ability of those funds to be used, the fact that it triggers Davis-Bacon. So echo those sentiments.
Yeah, in addition to all the great recommendations from Megan, Robert, and Cheryl, there are a lot of minor tweaks, straightforward, right, like common sense reforms in addition to those that have already been mentioned, right? The FHA 203K program, which allows for homeowners to get additional funds for renovation, can be used to finance ADUs. But right now, literally one word in the statute means that those ADUs must be attached to the house rather than a standalone ADU, right? A one-word change in statute. Similar things with HUD homes, manufactured homes that are required to have a permanent chassis. Removing that requirement could drive down the cost of housing. Modernizing the historic tax credit, which is an administrative process through the National Park Service, could unlock historic tax credits for housing development. And so there are a lot of minor tweaks that could really unlock federal programs to work better for housing development. And I think with that also goes investing in a functional, responsible HUD workforce, right? A lot of our programs, FHA's 221D4 program for multifamily mortgage insurance requires that developers, communicate with HUD on systems from the 80s and 90s. And so making sure that we have a HUD workforce that is capable of working with 21st century technology, I think is particularly important as the federal government incentivizes other ways that states and localities can also increase supply.
Thank you, Ben.
I'll just echo a couple of things. So although Build America, Buy America on its surface sounds like a great thing that we'd all want to be a part of, there's definitely cost implications for projects and some lack of clarity on waiver processes and technical assistance. So all of our developers that have been awarded home in this latest round where BABA is applicable, we're convening them as a team and doing some information sharing, but we're seeing cost escalations in the 30%-ish range because of Build America, Buy America. And then just a quick tag on Benjamin's point about HUD systems. I recently sent a screenshot of the, I don't know, 16 to 20 some HUD systems that we access just on the Public Housing Authority side alone. And they're slightly different between single family and multifamily. The systems don't really talk to each other. And the access steps to jump through can be a little time consuming. It took us 18 months to access our administrative funds in one of HUD's systems. And it was for little technicalities like OMB would update the footer on the form with a new date, although nothing substantive on the form had changed. And by the time they got around to processing the form that we had already submitted, there'll be a new date on the form. So we have to start the process all over again. So I think there is certainly room for streamlining and improvement and looking at ways that we can use information technology to streamline our processes across the board.
Thanks, Cheryl. And I know we have only a couple minutes left here, so I kind of want to do like a quick rapid fire round. And again, this is some of the things that you guys have already sort of touched on, but just considering the priorities of the new administration to streamline regulations and then also with Senator Scott, with Senate banking, finance, and potential tax bill consideration. His focus being previously on opportunity zones. I just sort of wanted to touch on whether there's, one or two recommendations that each of you want to discuss that could fit into sort of these current administration priorities, and then also kind of considering that focus on opportunity zones, how to serve the greatest need. So whether that's through something like opportunity zones, changes that need to be made there, or some of the ways to really target towards those with the greatest need. And is there anyone who would like to start?
Focus on cross-cutting requirements in transit so that we can get rid of parking minimums.
I would say on the Public Housing Authority side to look at the family self-sufficiency and homeownership components in the Housing Choice Voucher Program and provide better resources and incentives for public housing authorities to better deploy those tools so we can support our constituents and, yes, getting the rental assistance they need for the duration, but also helping folks move out beyond the voucher program when they're ready.
I'll just put yet another plug in for making sure that there are enhancements to the housing credit included in the reconciliation bill for Congress, and again also making sure that Congress protects the tax treatment of private activity bonds.
The two things I'll say are, improving the existing programs for increased accessibility and use by landlords and households. Would make the programs, sufficiently improved. And on opportunity zones, I think there's a need for both better data and better transparency about the extent to which opportunity zones and investors in opportunity zones are building housing and what sort of housing and where in any sort of opportunity zone expansion bill.
Thanks, Ben. With that, I do want to at least get to one of our audience questions here. So I'm going to go to the chat, and then we can also kind of do some follow-up after to get some of these questions answered, if that works with our panelists. But the first one that we got here, we have one from Eric Kingston talking about proposed cuts to CDFIs and how that might impact expanding the supply of housing that meets the needs and incomes of Americans, particularly rural Western communities.
For here in Montana, we certainly did see the executive order last Friday impacting CDFIs as well as the Interagency Council on Homelessness. I think we're still working to kind of wrap our arms around that executive order and what the impacts will be on our CDFI network, which has been pretty strong over the last number of years and excellent partners in our communities.
Yeah, I would just echo that. They really serve as a partner to both our state and also local governments and some innovative funding mechanisms and lending. So we're really just kind of reeling from this decision, and hopefully we can get some bounce back.
Thank you both. I'll do one more and then we can go ahead and wrap it up here. But we have two questions here from Nicole Borner, and it looks like they're both sort of related to rental cooperatives and the role that those might play in addressing the national housing crisis, especially in creating permanent affordable housing without relying solely on public housing or large-scale private landlords, and then also how that relates to preserving units while maintaining affordability.
The one thing I'll say here is that our cooperative market is growing pretty rapidly on both the rental side as well as the limited equity partnership side. And that kind of went on full blast when we removed occupancy limits throughout the state of Colorado to allow more than a couple of unrelated adults to live together in the same building. It facilitated the use of our single family home stock for greater numbers of citizens living together. So I would just say that that is one tool that we've utilized.
And I would say in Montana, certainly cooperatives on the homeownership side is something more of. I'm not aware of any robust efforts in Montana to look at rental style cooperatives, so I'll have to take that as a takeaway for me to look into.
Thank you, Cheryl. Well, with that, I know we're a minute over, so I just want to thank our panelists so much for their time. We really appreciate it. A lot of great recommendations shared today, and thanks to our audience for joining. And then just another shout out to our initiative partners, Arnold Ventures, JP Morgan Chase, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the National Association of Home Builders. So thank you all. And if you have any follow-up questions, I'll see whether we can get some contact information from our panelists to share with folks as well. Thank you all for tuning in. Have a
Thanks,
great
all.
rest of your day.